I had lived with my wife for 47 years and thought I knew everything about her. When she died, I was left alone in a house filled with her scent, her photographs, and dresses she never had the chance to wear. I opened her closet, hoping to find the strength to let the past go. But there, among silk scarves and neatly stacked boxes, I found a sealed envelope. On it was written my son-in-law's name. I took it to the lawyer, and when he opened it and turned pale, I realized my life was only just beginning. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Harold Fletcher. I was 72 years old and had retired a decade earlier from my position as a senior accountant at an insurance firm in Cedar Falls, Iowa. I spent 40 years combing through ledgers, receipts, and financial statements, finding patterns where others saw clutter. Numbers gave me comfort. They were dependable. They made sense. They didn't lie. But after my wife passed away, the numbers meant nothing. The house felt different the moment I stepped back into it, alone. It wasn't just empty. It was hollowed, as if something fundamental had been scooped out from its center, leaving only the shell behind. The grandfather clock in the hallway continued its slow, rhythmic ticking, a sound I used to find reassuring. Now it echoed like a metronome for grief. I hadn't wound it in weeks, yet it kept going, like it didn't care whether she was alive or dead. The air inside was thick with the scent of dried lavender. Margaret had kept little cloth sachets in the drawers, under the cushions, tucked in the closets. For decades, that smell meant home. Now it was a ghost. I walked from room to room, pausing in each doorway like a visitor, unsure if I had the right to enter. Her reading glasses still sat on the kitchen table, atop a folded newspaper from the week before she died. The mug she had last used, blue ceramic with a chip on the handle, rested in the sink with a faint ring of tea inside. I didn't move anything. I couldn't. In the living room, the beige recliner she favored faced the fireplace. There was an indentation in the cushion where her body used to be, and the afghan she'd crocheted last winter hung over the armrest. I stood behind it, gripping the fabric lightly between my fingers, remembering how she used to tug it over her knees with a sigh during cold nights. I didn't sit down. I wasn't ready to occupy her space. Instead, I wandered to the den and sat in the stiff leather armchair where I used to do our taxes. The desk lamp still worked, casting a warm yellow glow over the surface. I pulled open drawers mechanically, not looking for anything, just moving for the sake of movement. Paper clips, old checks, birthday cards from grandchildren, their drawings of houses and dogs and stick figure people. I closed the drawer again and let my hands rest in my lap. The phone rang once that day. It was a robocall about extended vehicle warranties. I didn't pick up. The answering machine beeped and recorded the message in its flat digital voice. Margaret used to say the machine sounded lonelier than we ever could. She was right. That evening, I warmed up leftover casserole, chicken and broccoli, the last thing she'd cooked and frozen. I ate it alone at the kitchen counter without setting the table. I didn't light a candle, didn't turn on music. I chewed slowly, without appetite, my eyes fixed on the small wall calendar she'd always updated religiously. It was still on April, though we were already deep into May. I thought about flipping it to the next month, but something inside me resisted. At bedtime, I brushed my teeth without looking in the mirror. I didn't want to see the man I had become without her. In the bedroom, I lay on the right side of the bed, out of habit. Her side remained untouched. The pillow was still fluffed. Her nightgown was draped across the chair beside the closet. I reached over once, in the dark, and touched her pillow lightly with my fingertips. Then I turned away from it, as though not to disturb her. Sleep didn't come easily. The wind pressed against the windows, and the branches of the sycamore tree outside scratched gently against the siding. I listened to the house breathe around me, its creaks, its sighs, its hidden murmurs that only became audible in mourning. At some point in the night, I rose and padded barefoot through the hallway. I stopped in front of her sewing room. The door was ajar. Inside, the moonlight pooled across the floorboards, catching the silver gleam of a pair of scissors on her desk. There was a spool of thread half unwound, trailing across the surface like a vein. I didn't go in. Instead, I walked down the stairs and stood at the threshold of her closet. It had always been hers. She called it her little sanctuary, though it was hardly bigger than a pantry. The door was closed, and I hadn't opened it since she passed. I stared at the brass knob for a long time, as if waiting for it to turn on its own. It didn't. I walked away. Back in bed, I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above. Its dull hum matched the rhythm of my thoughts, circling, but going nowhere. I knew I'd have to face it eventually. The closet, the clothes, the reminders of the life we built, and the secrets that might still lie folded between the sleeves of her cardigans or tucked behind her scarves. But not yet. Not tonight. I closed my eyes and let the silence wrap around me like one of her shawls, the kind she wore in winter, soft and warm and forever carrying the scent of her. It was early morning when I finally opened the closet. The sky was still a soft gray outside, the kind of light that made everything look gentler, quieter. I hadn't touched her things in weeks. I had dusted around them, vacuumed near the door, but I hadn't crossed that particular line. There was something sacred about that narrow white door with the antique brass knob, something final in the sound it made when it clicked shut. My hand hesitated on the knob. It was cold, even though the rest of the house was warm. I turned it slowly, like I was afraid it might break, or worse, open too easily. The door creaked the way old wood does when it's been left undisturbed for too long. The smell hit me first, not mold or decay, but something achingly familiar. Lavender, cedarwood, and faintly of her skin lotion, the one with the rose label and the pink cap she used for as long as I could remember. Inside, everything looked exactly as she'd left it. Blouses hung in gentle rows, organized by color, their sleeves tucked politely against their bodies. Cardigans, soft and neatly folded, rested on the shelf above. I reached for one, a powder blue with pearl buttons, and held it to my face. It still smelled like her. Not just the lotion or the detergent, but her. The way she used to smell when she leaned over the back of my chair to kiss the top of my head. Shoes were lined up in military precision on the floor. I could tell which ones were her favorites by the slight wear in the heel or the smudges on the toe. Her gardening sneakers had traces of soil in the treads, long since dried and crumbling, a quiet reminder of Saturday mornings spent kneeling in the dirt. The black pumps she wore to church were spotless, stored in their original box with tissue paper she had never thrown away. She treated even the mundane with reverence. I crouched down, brushing my fingers across the rug she'd placed there years ago, a faded green pattern with fraying edges. A shopping bag leaned against the wall. Inside were scarves, dozens of them, each with its own story. I pulled one out, a crimson silk square with golden patterns she bought at a market in New Mexico. I remembered the way it fluttered behind her neck in the wind as we crossed the parking lot that day, her laughter echoing louder than the cars around us. There was a jewelry tray on a small wall-mounted shelf, dusty but undisturbed. She kept her everyday pieces there, her wedding band, which I'd taken before the funeral, a pair of clip-on pearl earrings, and a thin silver chain with a small heart-shaped charm. I picked it up. The heart was warm, as if it had been waiting for me. The upper shelf held a few shoeboxes, all labeled in her looping handwriting. "Winter hats," one read. "Old photos," said another. But there was one tucked further back, wrapped in thick brown paper, unlike the rest. No label, no sign of what it held. I had to stand on my toes to reach it. and even then it nearly slipped from my grasp. I carried it carefully to the bed and peeled back the paper. Inside was a cream-colored envelope. It was sealed. Her handwriting stretched across the front in black ink, steady and unmistakable. It said only one name: David. I sat down slowly, holding the envelope like it might disintegrate in my hands. The weight of it wasn't in its contents, at least not yet, but in its implications. My son-in-law. Why would she write to him? Why would she seal it, hide it, and never mention it? My heart beat faster, and I had to remind myself to breathe. I didn't open it. I couldn't. Not then. I placed it gently on her side of the bed, against the pillow she had flattened over so many nights. It looked out of place. It looked like a message from another world, one I hadn't been invited to enter. I returned to the closet, unsure of what I was even looking for. Maybe I thought there'd be something else. Another letter, a clue, a whisper of explanation, but everything else was ordinary. Belts hung on brass hooks. A small wicker basket held spare buttons and tiny sewing kits she never used but kept, just in case. There were 2 handbags resting on the shelf, both empty, both meticulously clean inside. I sat on the floor, knees aching, and leaned against the closet frame. A pair of her slippers peeked out from under a hanging robe. I picked one up, feeling how light it was, how shaped it still was by the curve of her foot. I placed it back carefully. I hadn't cried at the funeral, hadn't cried at all, but the tears came then, in that cramped space full of her. The closet wasn't just a place where she stored clothes. It was a shrine to her rhythm, her presence, her logic. Each item told me something about her taste, her patience, her quiet discipline. She had built a world within those walls, and I had never truly seen it until she was gone. I stood up eventually, my legs protesting, and closed the door with the same care I'd used to open it. The envelope was still on the bed. The name still stared back at me. I stared back, not knowing if I was ready to understand what she hadn't told me while she was alive. Downstairs, the kettle whistled softly on the stove, though I hadn't remembered turning it on. I walked toward the sound, feeling the weight of paper and ink pressing into the back of my mind. The house didn't feel quiet anymore. It felt full of questions, of echoes, of choices I would soon have to make. I left the envelope on the bed and walked out of the room, but it didn't stay there. It followed me in the silence. Every room I entered felt like it whispered about it. I could hear the echo of her handwriting inside my skull, could see the dark ink on the cream paper whenever I closed my eyes. The house was trying to return to its usual rhythm. Cicadas outside, the fridge humming, the clock in the hallway ticking like an old metronome. But that folded sealed paper had changed everything. I stood at the kitchen sink with my hands braced on either side, watching a bead of water slip slowly down the faucet neck, like a clock ticking in liquid form. Outside, the garden she once loved looked tired and wild. The geraniums were overgrown, leaning heavy toward the earth. She would have scolded me for letting them sag like that. She'd always had her hands in the dirt, always in motion, always fixing or trimming or watering. She believed order in the garden could bring peace to the house. There was no peace now. I made coffee I didn't want. My hands moved through the motions mechanically, scooping the grounds, filling the pot, pressing the button. I opened the cupboard to get her favorite mug, the one with the faint floral pattern around the lip, the one she never let anyone else use. I didn't know why I chose it. Maybe I wanted to feel closer to her. Maybe I wanted to punish myself. I poured the coffee, set it on the table, and didn't drink it. Instead, I sat there staring at the knot in the wood grain near the sugar bowl. It looked like an eye, almost, and for a moment I had the uncanny feeling that the house was watching me, waiting to see what I would do. I got up, left the coffee steaming, and climbed the stairs back to the bedroom. The envelope was still there. Still just paper and ink, but heavier now, like it had absorbed the weight of the hours that had passed. I stood over it for a long time before picking it up. The seal was perfectly intact. No cracks, no peeling edges. She'd pressed it closed carefully, deliberately. It wasn't just a note. It was something meant to stay shut until the right hands opened it. I wondered if I was those hands. I carried it with me to the armchair in the den, the one that had begun to sag in the cushion from years of my sitting in it. The afternoon light spilled through the slats of the blinds, casting long bars across the floor, like shadows of a cage. I ran my finger along the envelope's edge. The paper was thick, not something she would have used for everyday things. It was stationery from the small shop downtown, the one with the bell on the door and the shelves of ink pens in glass cases. She only went there for serious correspondence, thank you notes after funerals, letters to lawyers, things that mattered. I couldn't bring myself to open it. I turned it over and over in my hands, feeling its corners, listening for a sound that didn't come. The silence around me thickened. Even the birds outside seemed to have stopped their calls. I rested the envelope on my lap and stared out the window, trying to remember the last conversation I'd had with David, my son-in-law. He'd visited a week before the funeral, stood in this very room, hands in his pockets, eyes on the bookshelves. He didn't say much, never did. He was the kind of man who filled a room with quiet dominance, a presence made more of posture than words. Margaret used to say he reminded her of a man who always knew more than he let on. At the time, I thought it was a compliment. Now I wasn't so sure. The envelope didn't just hold words, it held a decision. Once I broke the seal, I would learn something I could never unlearn. Whatever she had written, she had done so without telling me. That meant it was either meant to protect me, or meant to bypass me. The thought stung. We had shared everything, or so I believed. I looked around the room. On the shelf sat a photo of our daughter at her wedding, David beside her, smiling tightly. Margaret had chosen the frame, a pewter one shaped like vines curling around the corners. I hadn't really looked at that picture in years, but now, staring into his face, I tried to read something in it. Guilt? Secrets? Or was I imagining things, planting doubt where none existed? I stood again, restless, and returned to the hallway. I could feel the throb of old memories along the floorboards. The spot near the linen closet still creaked, just as it had when our daughter used to sneak out at night as a teenager. The scent of furniture polish lingered faintly from years of her Saturday morning cleaning rituals. Every inch of this house bore her fingerprints. In the hallway closet, I pulled out the old shoebox where we kept important papers, marriage certificate, birth certificates, copies of our wills. It was dusty, but untouched. I placed the envelope inside, between my life insurance policy and the deed to the house. Then I closed the lid. But I didn't feel relieved. I felt like a man who'd just buried something twice. I went to the garage, thinking maybe physical labor would distract me. I swept the floor, reorganized the tool chest, untangled an old extension cord. I wiped down the garden shears, though I hadn't used them in over a year. Nothing helped. Every motion circled back to that envelope, like a thread tied to my spine. As evening approached, the shadows in the house grew long and soft. The television buzzed faintly in the background. I'd turned it on out of habit, but left the volume low. A cooking show flickered across the screen, showing hands slicing onions with surgical precision. I watched for a few minutes, not absorbing a single word, then turned it off. Back upstairs, I opened the shoebox again. I held the envelope under the lamplight at my desk. The seal glinted slightly, catching the glow like a signal flare. I considered tearing it open right then, but instead, I placed it into a clean manila folder, labeled it private, and slid it into my briefcase. I would take it to someone who could help me understand what it meant. Not David, Not my daughter. Someone who would read it and tell me what it required. Someone with no skin in the game. That night, as I undressed for bed, I found myself folding my shirt with more care than usual, as if I needed one act of neatness to balance the disorder inside me. I placed the folded shirt on the chair in the corner, beside the envelope's empty resting place on the bed. I slid under the covers, the cool sheets making me flinch. I turned off the light, and lay there, listening to the clock tick in the hallway, every second landing like a drop of water into a still pond. The envelope was gone from sight, but not from mind. It was with me, lodged beneath my ribs, pressing like a truth not yet spoken. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed with the blankets pulled up to my chest, eyes open to the ceiling, where the slow whirl of the fan cast curved shadows that turned like a compass needle without direction. The hum of it was steady, but my thoughts thrashed against it like wind against a screen door. The house made sounds I'd never noticed before. The walls expanded and contracted with temperature. Pipes clicked softly in the crawlspace beneath the floorboards. Somewhere downstairs, the old fridge let out a long, guttural sigh, like a man exhaling in his sleep. I couldn't tell if these were ordinary sounds, or if the house was talking to me in its own language, groans and shifts that mirrored the pressure building behind my ribs. The envelope was downstairs, sealed in a folder inside my old brown leather briefcase. I'd zipped it shut like that would keep it quiet, but I could feel it through the walls, like an instrument vibrating from a distant tune. I tried to ignore it, tried to count backwards from 100, tried to name state capitals in alphabetical order, useless rituals I'd picked up over the years when sleep came slow. Nothing helped. My mind circled back to the curve of Margaret's handwriting and the tight line of the seal. I turned on the lamp beside the bed. The yellow glow pooled onto the nightstand, illuminating the edges of her glasses case, a half-empty bottle of lavender lotion, and her copy of Wuthering Heights with a bookmark still wedged on page 142. She'd reread it every year. She said she liked the idea that ghosts could want things. Now I wondered if she had become one herself, leaving behind objects that still reached for me. The air was stale, thick with the scent of linen, dust, and something sweet that clung to her pillow, like memory. I sat up and swung my legs over the side of the bed. The floor was cold beneath my feet, the way it always was around 3 a.m., no matter the season. I slipped into my slippers and pulled on the old flannel robe she had gifted me the Christmas before last. The sleeves were frayed near the wrists. One of the belt loops was missing. I tied it anyway and made my way down the hall. The grandfather clock stood like a sentinel in the dark. I paused in front of it. It read 3:27. I hadn't wound it in a week, and yet it ticked on, like it refused to acknowledge neglect. I reached for the key from the drawer in the entry table and wound it, the gears inside clinking faintly with each turn. When I finished, I rested my hand on its wooden frame and waited for the chime. None came. It wasn't time yet. In the kitchen, I flipped on the overhead light and winced at how harsh it looked. I dimmed it back down and put on the kettle. It clicked as it heated, steam whispering at the seams. I stood with my palms flat on the countertop, staring at the pale light through the window. The backyard was black, save for the distant orange glow of a neighbor's porch lamp. I could see the silhouette of the birdbath, tipped slightly from last winter's frost, and the spindly skeleton of the fig tree she planted years ago that never quite took. The kettle whistled gently. I poured the water into a mug, then added a chamomile tea bag from the tin by the sink. Margaret's handwriting labeled it sleepy tea. I held the cup in both hands, not drinking yet, just absorbing the warmth into my fingers. There was a notch on the rim of the mug. She'd chipped it doing dishes and never replaced it. Said imperfections made things real. I sat at the table and finally took a sip. The tea was weak but warm, and I imagined her sitting across from me, wrapped in her shawl, hands folded, looking at me the way she did when she wanted me to confess something before I even said a word. She would have known what to do with the envelope. She would have told me whether I should read it, burn it, or hand it off to someone with clearer eyes. But she wasn't here. I got up, moved to the den, and sat down in the recliner. The briefcase rested on the floor beside the bookshelf. I didn't touch it. Instead, I reached for the photo album that sat beneath the old radio. The spine cracked as I opened it. The pages smelled like dry paper and time. I flipped through our lives, birthdays, cookouts, the trip to Charleston where it rained for 3 days straight, and we still smiled through it. There were pictures of David, too, of course. One from the wedding, another from Christmas 3 years ago, holding our grandson with that wide, practiced grin. I stared at his eyes, trying to decode what might have lived behind them even then. I closed the album and leaned back. My tea had gone cold. The fan above stirred the air, but brought no relief. I rose again and walked slowly to the window. The sky was beginning to change. A lighter blue crept into the blackness, the earliest hint of morning. Birds would come soon, and the street would fill again with life, pretending to be normal. I wasn't ready for that. I went upstairs. In the bathroom, I washed my face with cold water. I looked at myself in the mirror. The lines around my eyes seemed deeper than the night before. My mouth, downturned. The man staring back looked like someone who had carried too much without knowing it. I dried my face on her towel, floral embroidery at the edge, slightly rough from age. She had always refused to replace the set, said she liked how they held her scent. Back in the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the spot where the envelope had lain hours earlier. The indentation on the comforter was still there. I placed my hand on it, and it felt faintly warm, though I knew it was my imagination. The room was filling with light now, a pale bluish silver that softened every corner. It reminded me of hospital mornings, the ones where you watched someone sleep and prayed they'd wake up different, better. Or maybe just at all. The birds began to sing. I closed my eyes and listened, letting the sound fill me. I still didn't have an answer. I didn't know what the envelope contained, or what it would demand from me. But I knew one thing with certainty. Sleep would not find me until I understood why she had kept it from me, and why she had written his name. I rose, opened the closet, and began to dress. The long night was over, but the questions had only just begun. The morning was cold, unusually so for early spring. I remember the kind of chill that creeps into your bones even when the sun is shining, like a warning carried on the wind. I dressed slower than usual, standing in the soft light that filtered through the bedroom curtains. My fingers moved stiffly through the buttons of my shirt, the fabric thin from years of wash and wear. It was the pale blue one Margaret used to iron every Sunday evening, saying it made me look more trustworthy. I hadn't worn it in months, maybe longer. I reached for the dark gray wool blazer that still smelled faintly of cedar and old tobacco. I hadn't smoked since the early 90s, but the scent had lingered deep in the lining, trapped in time like everything else in this house. I combed my hair with water from the sink, wiped my glasses with the cloth she used to fold neatly in the top drawer, and stared at myself in the mirror above the dresser. The face looking back was lined and drawn, the skin under the eyes puffier than it had been just a week ago. I retrieved the envelope from the briefcase in the den. It felt heavier now, like it had absorbed every ounce of hesitation, every hour of sleepless circling. I slid it into a manila folder and pressed it flat with my hand, then slipped it into the inside pocket of my blazer. I checked 3 times to make sure it was secure, patting the spot as if it might vanish. The drive to the law office took 13 minutes. I'd driven it hundreds of times over the years. Same stretch of road past the fire station, the shuttered diner with the faded breakfast all day sign, and the church where we'd renewed our vows on our 40th anniversary. That day had been windy, and full of light. Today the sky hung low and gray, like a lid over the town. I parked in front of the small brick building that housed Carter and Weissman, attorneys at law. The plaque on the door hadn't changed in 20 years, though the gold lettering had dulled. The waiting room smelled of lemon polish and institutional carpet. The chairs were still too stiff, the magazines still out of date. I sat down beneath the watercolor of the Iowa cornfields and waited while the receptionist made a brief call. Mr. Carter came out himself to greet me. He looked thinner than I remembered, his hair gone almost entirely white. His eyes, however, were as alert as ever, tucked behind those thin-rimmed glasses he'd worn since the Reagan administration. We shook hands briefly. His skin was cold and dry, his grip efficient. He led me down the familiar hallway to his office, where the same oak desk sat centered beneath 2 tall bookshelves filled with identical green and burgundy volumes no one had opened in decades. I took a seat across from him in the leather chair that let out a sigh as I sank into it. He offered coffee. I declined. He asked how I was holding up. I lied. I told him I'd found something I didn't know how to handle, and I pulled the envelope from my pocket and laid it on his desk, face up. His eyes narrowed slightly as he read the name written in Margaret's script. Then, without a word, he opened the top drawer of his desk and took out a silver letter opener. The envelope made a soft tearing sound as he slid the blade beneath the seal. It reminded me of the sound of her ripping paper off a Christmas gift, slow, careful, like the paper itself had value. He removed the contents and unfolded the first page. I watched his face. At first, it was unreadable, a professional mask honed over decades. But as his eyes moved down the page, something shifted. His lips pressed into a thin line, his brow lowered. He glanced at me once, then returned to the letter. His posture changed. He leaned forward slightly, as though drawn closer by the words on the page. He didn't speak right away. He read through everything, 2 pages, front and back. Then he gathered them slowly, tapped them neatly into a stack, and placed them face down on the desk. I waited. He took a breath, a long one. Then he reached into another drawer and removed a small yellow legal pad. He clicked his pen and began jotting something quickly, with precise strokes, the way he always did when the situation shifted from emotional to procedural. I didn't interrupt. I sat in that cold, echoing room, surrounded by the ticking of the wall clock and the distant shuffle of paperwork from behind the hallway doors. A faint draft came through the old windows, stirring the edge of the curtains. Finally, he looked up. I could see it in his face. Whatever was in those pages, it mattered. Not just sentimentally, legally. He slid the legal pad toward me and pointed at a name, a bank, a fund, a set of numbers. I stared down at them, trying to make sense of what was written, but the words floated. My mind felt foggy, like I'd stood up too fast. I clenched my hands in my lap and looked at him again, and he nodded, slowly, gravely. He said he would need to contact a third party, possibly the estate trustee. He asked if I'd be willing to leave the documents with him. I said yes. I couldn't bear to take them home again. He promised to make copies, to begin a file, to contact me by the end of the week. His tone was calm, but there was something underneath it, something like disbelief. I rose. My knees cracked with the motion. He stood with me, held the door open, placed a hand gently on my shoulder as I passed. It was the same hand he'd used to pass me tissues during my wife's funeral. But this time, it felt heavier, not with sympathy, but with the weight of something shared. I drove home in silence. The radio stayed off. The car felt cold despite the heater. I passed the same landmarks, but they no longer registered. It wasn't until I pulled into the driveway that I realized I'd been holding the steering wheel so tightly, my palms ached. I entered the house through the side door, where Margaret used to kick off her shoes and hum while putting groceries away. The kitchen was quiet now. The tea mug from the night before still sat on the counter, stained at the bottom. I rinsed it out slowly and placed it upside down to dry. In the den, I sat down in the same armchair. The briefcase was empty now. I stared at it, the soft leather folding slightly like a chest without breath. The room held a new kind of silence. Not emptiness, but anticipation. I didn't know exactly what the lawyer had read. Not yet. But I had seen the color drain from his face, and I had felt, in the careful way he avoided my eyes, that Margaret had left behind something far more powerful than I had ever imagined. Something that might not have been meant for me at all, but had found me anyway. That night I couldn't stop thinking about his face. Not the words he spoke, those were few and careful, but the exact way his expression shifted as he read. I could recall every muscle, every blink, every silent pause in the movement of his jaw. It had been subtle, almost imperceptible. But to a man like me, trained for decades to recognize tiny discrepancies in numbers, habits, margins, it was unmistakable. Something in that letter had pulled him out of his practiced composure. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into a pause, a breath, the tightening of his lips. But there was a moment, only seconds long, when his hand froze midway through turning the page, and his eyes stayed glued to a particular line, like he was reading it a second time to be sure it said what he thought it said. That was the moment I saw it. A flicker. Not shock exactly. Not fear. Something older than that. Recognition. I spent most of the evening in the den. The sun had started to set, casting long fingers of light across the carpet, filtering through the blinds and striping the room like prison bars. I sat in my chair with a blanket draped across my knees, the same one Margaret used to pull over me when I napped in front of the television. It still smelled faintly of her shampoo. I hadn't washed it in months, maybe longer. The briefcase was still there, though now it held only an empty folder and the faint smell of paper and leather. I reached in and ran my fingers across the bottom, as though something might still be hiding in there, tucked beneath the lining. Nothing. Just the ghost of what had been. I rose and walked into the kitchen. The house felt heavier. Not louder or busier, just heavier, as if the walls had heard what Carter read and were now burdened by it too. I filled the kettle and placed it on the stove, then leaned on the counter with both hands, waiting for the whistle. The ticking of the wall clock behind me kept time like a slow heartbeat. I imagined Margaret there beside me, arms crossed, asking me what I thought it meant. I had no answer, only that expression on Carter's face. The kettle whined softly. I poured the water into a mug, added a bag of black tea, and stood without drinking it. The steam curled upward, catching the light, then vanished. Everything vanished eventually. Paper burns, ink fades, but expressions, real ones, stay. When I returned to the den, I sat again and closed my eyes. I didn't sleep. I let the memory play like a reel of film, back and forth. The exact moment Carter lifted the second page. How he shifted slightly in his seat. How he adjusted his glasses not because they slipped, but because he needed a moment. I'd seen that gesture 100 times. He used it during estate readings, always before saying something delicate. Like when he had to explain to a family that a will had changed, or a beneficiary had been removed. He hadn't said anything like that to me. Not yet. But it was there in his posture. Something significant had been transferred or revoked. Something that required his silence, his care, his deliberate language. I remembered how, after reading, he tapped the edges of the papers into a neat stack. It wasn't just habit. It was a ritual of control. When the contents were too heavy, he would perform small tasks to stabilize himself. I'd seen him do it after Margaret's parents died, when he read their will aloud and revealed the split in the inheritance no one had expected. That same stack tap, that same quiet exhale through the nose, that same tightening around the mouth. The only difference was that this time, he didn't look me in the eye afterward. Not right away. He kept his gaze on the papers for a long time, then shifted it to the yellow pad, where he scribbled something with fast, angular strokes. I tried to see it, but he turned the pad slightly, a small protective gesture. He hadn't done that before. Carter was always transparent, sometimes to a fault. Now he was guarding something, a truth maybe, or a name. I got up again and paced the hallway. The walls carried old photographs. Margaret in her garden hat, holding up a basket of tomatoes. Our daughter on her wedding day, arm in arm with David, the wind catching the veil just enough to lift it like a sail. My own portrait from the insurance company's retirement dinner, holding a plaque I never hung. All those images, fixed smiles, frozen time, none of them hinted at what was in that envelope. But now every one of them seemed suspect. Was Margaret smiling because she knew something? Had she placed herself in those moments knowing she'd one day leave behind a revelation that would split open the calm surface of our lives? I walked into the laundry room, not because I needed anything, but because it was one of the few places untouched by memory. The detergent still smelled sharp, clinical. I opened the dryer and closed it again. A mundane action, something neutral, something that didn't demand interpretation. But even there, I found myself thinking about the lawyer's face. It was late by then, the kind of late when the house starts to creak and shift as it settles. I returned to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. Margaret's side was still made, as I had kept it. Her pillow fluffed, the quilt folded just so. I rested my hand on the fabric, not moving. The room was dark, except for the faint orange glow of the streetlight outside. It cast a long sliver of light across the closet door, the very door behind which the envelope had waited. I thought about calling Carter, asking directly, demanding even. But something held me back. Maybe it was pride, maybe fear, maybe the knowledge that once a thing is named, it becomes real. Instead, I lay down, turned toward her pillow, and closed my eyes. But his face stayed with me, not just the look of surprise or calculation. It was something deeper, something colder. It was the face of a man who had just realized he was holding dynamite, and that someone, somewhere, had already lit the fuse. The envelope returned to me 3 days later, but it didn't arrive alone. Carter called that morning while I was polishing Margaret's silver, a habit I kept mostly for ritual now, not necessity. The flatware hadn't been used in years. I'd laid each piece out across the table, the handles catching the light from the kitchen window, dulled by fingerprints and time. Her favorite was the pastry fork, with the slight twist in the tine. She said it made her feel fancy, even when she ate a muffin. I was halfway through rubbing it with a cloth when the phone rang. Not the cell phone, the landline, the one she insisted we keep just in case. I recognized his voice immediately. Even through the receiver, I could tell something had shifted. His sentences were shorter, his pauses longer. He asked if I could come by that afternoon. No details, just the sort of clipped tone that left a gap wide enough to fall through. I agreed and hung up. The silence that followed felt different this time, not heavy with dread, but dense with inevitability. I arrived at the office early. The receptionist didn't smile. She motioned me back with a nod, and I walked the now familiar hallway, the carpet edges slightly curled from years of feet making the same hesitant journey. Carter was already standing when I entered. He gestured to the chair, then sat behind his desk with the air of a man who had prepared carefully for what he was about to say. The folder lay in front of him, the same manila one I had used, but it was thicker now. Documents had been added. I recognized the envelope, still sealed. He had made copies instead of breaking it completely. Good. I appreciated that. He slid the folder toward me and tapped the edge twice. A small deliberate movement that told me he was giving me control, but reserving the interpretation. I opened it slowly. Inside were several documents, printed pages, copies of statements, notarized amendments, some with Margaret's signature, some with mine, some, surprisingly, with David's. The first was a copy of a financial document, a trust established 6 years ago. The name at the top made my throat tighten. The Fletcher Discretionary Family Trust. I didn't remember signing anything like that. My name was there, yes, but the date rang no bell. I'd been in the hospital that month after my heart stent, sedated, disoriented. It was plausible. Margaret had signed it too. Her signature was firm, steady. I ran my finger over the ink as though I could feel her in the stroke of the pen. The next few pages were bank statements, transfers, regular and consistent. Thousands of dollars moved from the trust into a personal account under David's name. Not monthly, but quarterly. Structured. Quiet. I flipped through the printouts. There was a pattern. Withdrawals lined up with events. Renovations on their home. The new SUV. Even the tuition deposit for their oldest son's private school. I remembered the way David used to talk about his work. Vague consulting contracts. Lots of travel. Always just enough detail to seem plausible, but never enough to hold weight. I remembered wondering how they afforded that house, that lifestyle. Margaret had waved away my doubts. "He does well," she had said, as if that explained everything. I reached another document, a letter from Margaret, typed, dated, addressed to Carter himself. She explained her awareness of the transfers. She described how she had allowed them to continue, for a while, believing that it was helping their daughter, helping the grandchildren, keeping peace in the family. But she had come to regret it, deeply. Her words were formal, but carried weight. "I have decided to terminate David's position as co-beneficiary effective immediately," she had written. "It is my intention that Harold receive full disclosure upon my passing. Please ensure that the documentation is clear, complete, and enforceable." The next page was an amendment to her will, signed and notarized. She had removed David's name from the trust, the estate, the property succession. Everything. She had included a note in the margin. "Do not tell Harold until I am gone. I do not want this to weigh on him." I stared at that line for what felt like hours. I had lived beside her, slept beside her, shared meals, memories, illnesses, small joys, and deep griefs. And she had carried this alone, quietly, gently, as if she had been trying to protect me from something I had every right to know. Carter remained silent. He gave me the space. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. A cheap plastic frame, gold-painted, hands moving in perfect rhythm. It sounded like time was mocking me. I wiped my palm against my slacks and turned to the last set of papers. An affidavit. From David. Dated 2 years ago. A confession. Not to criminal wrongdoing, not quite, but an acknowledgement that he had accepted funds without clear authorization, that he had misunderstood the structure of the trust, and that he regretted any confusion caused. Legal language, but underneath it, an admission of guilt. Not enough to indict, but enough to remove him. Carter finally spoke then. He explained what the next steps would be. That Margaret had ensured her legal intentions were in order. That David had already been notified of the changes posthumously, and that, according to the terms, he had no legal claim to dispute. He said all this with his usual measured cadence, but there was an undertow in his voice, one of caution, as if we were crossing a threshold from misunderstanding to confrontation. I closed the folder and set it back on the desk. My hands felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. I looked around the room, the diploma from Columbia Law, the photo of Carter and his dog fishing at Lake Okoboji, the potted fern wilting slightly near the window. Normal things in an abnormal moment. He offered to send copies to my home. I declined. I would take them myself. I wanted the weight of them. I wanted to feel them in my hands as I walked out into the world where everyone still thought David was a good man. Back at home, I set the folder down on the dining table, the one Margaret and I had refinished together years ago when money was tight, and she said sanding furniture was romantic. The wood was smooth under my fingers. The grain curled like lines on a palm, revealing a future no one could read. I opened the curtains, let the light fall across the pages. I didn't read them again, not yet. I just let them sit there, let them breathe in the room she had filled with warmth and silence. The house had always belonged to her in spirit. Now it belonged to her in voice. And in that folder, she had spoken louder than she ever had in life. The documents remained on the dining table for nearly 2 days before I had the strength to read them again. I would pass by them on my way to the kitchen, glance at the folder, feel the weight in my chest shift, and keep walking. I found other things to do. Washed windows that weren't dirty, rearranged books that didn't need moving, dusted baseboards I could barely bend down to reach. All of it meaningless, none of it able to drown out the rustling sound of the pages in my memory. But late on the second night, when the hum of the refrigerator was the only sound left in the house, I pulled out a chair and sat. The cushion still held her shape from all those years of Sunday mornings, where she'd read the paper and circled recipes she'd never get around to cooking. I placed my palms on the wood and let them rest there for a while. Then I opened the folder. Reading it again wasn't easier the second time. In fact, it was worse. The first time, I had been too shocked to absorb it all. This time, the words found their place and stayed. They anchored themselves, burrowed. I studied her typed letter more closely. Her voice was there in the syntax, short, purposeful sentences, no rambling, no emotion in the tone, only in what was withheld. She spoke of David's actions with restraint, but I could read between the lines. She had been disappointed, not just in him, but in herself, for letting it go on as long as it did. That was the part that broke me. I thought about all the nights she must have lain beside me, quiet, her eyes on the ceiling or turned away in the dark, carrying this knowledge alone. I thought about her smile at family dinners, while David poured wine like he owned the place, how she must have watched him with 1,000 unsaid thoughts tucked behind her eyes. And I had been sitting right beside her, clueless. The betrayal wasn't just his, it was mine, too. A betrayal of attention, of assumption. I took off my glasses and rubbed the bridge of my nose. The air in the room felt thick, like the house itself was holding its breath. A low creak echoed from the hallway, the same board that always spoke when someone stepped near the stairs. But I was alone. I stood and walked into the kitchen. The teapot was still on the stove, though I hadn't used it all day. I filled it with water and set it to boil. There was something about the process, measured, slow, that helped. Margaret used to call tea her reset button. I hoped she was right. While it heated, I stared out the window. The yard was dark, the porch light casting a yellow circle on the brick path. The wind had picked up, and the old maple tree in the corner shuddered. I remembered the day we planted it, after our daughter was born. We'd buried a silver coin beneath it for luck. She always said it was the most honest tree she'd ever met. Crooked, stubborn, alive. When the kettle whistled, I poured the water into her porcelain mug, the one with the faded pink rose and a crack that ran like a fault line down the side. I held it in both hands as I walked back to the table, feeling the warmth bleed into my palms. I sat again. The bank statements were dry, cold things, figures and dates, clear as crime scene photos, but I studied them like a forensic accountant, tracing the pattern of his withdrawals. Every transaction now glowed with context. A sudden consulting fee, just days before our granddaughter's birthday. A lump sum contract deposit right before the down payment on their new car. They hadn't been windfalls. They were extractions from us. I flipped to the affidavit. The wording there stung. Carefully crafted admissions, thinly veiled justifications. Miscommunication. Assumed authority. Unclear terms. Not once did he write, "I knew what I was doing," but I could see it. In the numbers, in the timeline, in the way he had avoided specifics all these years. And still, Margaret hadn't exposed him. She had taken steps, yes, removed his name, altered the documents, drafted the truth in legal ink, but she hadn't confronted him. She had never said a word to me. I imagined her standing in the kitchen, stirring her tea, wondering how much longer she could carry the silence. I imagined her protecting me. That realization broke something loose. I pushed the folder away and leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands in my hair. Grief surged again, but differently this time. Not for her death, but for the quiet burden she had lived with in her final years. The knowledge she had shouldered while smiling through anniversaries, holidays, Sunday brunches. All so that I wouldn't see what had become of our son-in-law, or maybe what had become of us. People too blind, too trusting, too old to see the theft hiding in plain sight. I thought of our daughter too, whether she knew, whether she had looked the other way, or been deceived just like me. I couldn't tell what hurt more, the betrayal or the not knowing who else had chosen silence. I got up and began pacing the room. The house felt small, the ceilings lower than usual. I passed through the hallway and touched the frame of our wedding photo. Margaret in a lace veil, eyes half-lidded against the sun, me in a suit too big for my shoulders. We'd started with nothing. Everything we had built, slowly, honestly. And now, that foundation had a crack in it, not from time, but from people. In the bedroom, I opened her closet again, not to look for anything, just to feel near her. The scent of lavender and wool still lived in the fabric. Her scarves hung like frozen moments, each one tied to a memory. I touched the green one she wore the day our daughter graduated college. I pulled it gently from the hanger and pressed it to my face. I whispered her name into the dark, and no one answered. Back at the table, the tea had gone cold. The documents remained open, their truths impossible to fold back up. I looked at them one last time before sliding them into a drawer in the hutch, between the linen napkins and the box of candlesticks we never used. But I didn't lock the drawer. I wanted to know they were there, real, unchangeable, just like the pain. I spent the next morning moving through the house as if Margaret were still there. Not in a delusional way, not quite, but in that quiet rhythm of long habits, when your body reaches for someone before your mind has the chance to remind you, they're gone. I found myself speaking to her in silence, through gestures, through the weight of old rituals. I woke before sunrise, as I always did when she was alive, and walked into the kitchen in my slippers, the way she used to complain about because they dragged and left little scuffs on the linoleum. I made tea instead of coffee, just as she liked it. One bag steeped exactly 3 minutes, and never stirred. She said stirring bruised the leaves. I never really believed that, but I stopped doing it anyway. Her mug was on the second shelf, the same one. White ceramic with a faint pink floral design, the gold rim chipped from years of turning in her hands. I held it between my palms and pressed it to my chest for a moment before pouring the hot water in. The scent of chamomile rose with the steam and filled the kitchen like her perfume used to. Light, calming, gone too soon. I didn't sit at the table. I leaned against the counter the way she used to, one hand on the edge, eyes out the window. The yard was still there, same as ever. The flower beds had begun to wake for the season, daffodils pushing up through the thawed earth, not yet blooming, but full of promise. She had planted them 20 years ago and whispered to them every spring. "You're late," she used to tease them, "but you're forgiven." That morning, they were early. I wandered back into the living room and stood in front of her bookshelf. Her books were still arranged the way she liked. Fiction on the left, non-fiction on the right, cookbooks and poetry in the middle like a fragile treaty. I ran my finger along the spines and stopped at one she always read in the fall, Leaves of Grass. Inside was a dried maple leaf she had picked up from the backyard the year after our daughter moved out. She said it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen fall alone. I left the book open and moved on. In the hallway, I paused at the photo wall. Margaret had curated it like an exhibition, changing frames as the family grew. Each photo was a time capsule, full of faces that hadn't yet learned how fragile happiness could be. There she was in every frame, sometimes front and center, sometimes in the background, always watching, always shaping the scene in some small way. Her eyes followed me as I walked past. Not literally, of course, but in that way photographs sometimes do, when love has been pressed into them over time. I opened the linen closet and just stood there. The smell of her lingered in the folded sheets. Lavender, clean cotton, the faint trace of fabric softener she'd never switch no matter how many brands came out. I pulled out one of the pillowcases and held it to my face. It was like breathing in memory, warm and painful. Back in the bedroom, I sat at her vanity table. She had kept it tidy, always. Hairbrush aligned with the edge, bottles ordered by size, a small porcelain dish where she kept her earrings. None expensive, all precious. I picked up one of the pearl studs and closed it in my fist. I remembered the day I gave them to her. Not an anniversary, just a Tuesday. She cried when I handed her the little box, said no one had ever surprised her on an ordinary day. The mirror in front of me reflected a man I barely recognized. My face had aged in strange ways. Grief had done something to it, hollowed certain parts, hardened others. My eyes looked more like my father's now, quiet, dark, endlessly tired. I reached up and touched my cheek as if to confirm it was still me. I opened her closet door again. The dresses hung like sighs. The space felt holy, untouchable. I stepped inside and pulled the light chain. A soft yellow glow filled the space, and I let my hand drift over the fabric. Wool, silk, cotton. Some clothes still had the tags. She had a habit of buying things she'd grow into, though she never meant physically. She meant emotionally. Some colors, she said, you had to earn. I sat on the stool inside and just listened. The faint ticking of the house, the refrigerator cycling, the clock on the wall 2 rooms over marking another minute I didn't ask for. My eyes landed on a shoebox tucked behind her winter coats. It wasn't labeled. I pulled it out and set it on my lap. Inside were letters, some addressed to her sister, some to friends who had moved away. Some, I realized with a jolt, to me. Never sent, never given. They were written in her handwriting, the one I could still recognize in my sleep. One dated 5 years ago simply began, "I hope you never have to read this, but I need to say it anyway." I didn't read further. Not yet. I returned the box and turned off the light. The bulb flickered once before dying. The chain swung gently as I stepped out and closed the door behind me. By the afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the garden shed. I hadn't gone inside since she passed. The door creaked the same way it always had, but the inside smelled different. Damp earth, old wood, rust. Her gloves were still hanging on the hook, the fingers curled in on themselves like they missed her hands. I brushed dirt from the gardening bench and sat. It was here that she had told me she wanted to be cremated. No big ceremony, no church, just the garden and the sky, and maybe a good story or two. I remembered how the light hit her face that day, filtering through the slats of the shed, making her look both strong and impossibly fragile. I spoke to her out loud then. Not words, not questions, just her name. Once. When I stood, I noticed a small trowel lying where she'd last left it. The blade still held the shape of the soil she had pressed into. I picked it up and cleaned it gently with my sleeve. Back in the house, the folder of documents still lay on the dining table. But I no longer feared it. Margaret had left it for me, yes, but she had also left everything else. The garden, the teacups, the pillowcases, the memory of her laughter in the upstairs hallway, the worn corner of the rug where she used to sit and talk on the phone, the stories hidden in shoeboxes, the silence that wasn't empty, but full of her. I didn't cry that night, but I also didn't turn on the lights. I walked through the house in the dark, my hand trailing along the walls she once painted, the windows she once opened, the doorways she once passed through like the wind. And for the first time since she died, I wasn't alone. I spent the next several days avoiding people, places, and most of all, decisions. The documents were locked in the desk drawer beneath the stack of Margaret's stationery, but I didn't need to look at them anymore. Every line had etched itself into my thoughts. The contents didn't change, but something in me had, and I didn't yet know what to do with it. Mornings became the hardest. The air felt too clean, too sharp, and the light came in without permission. I'd wake to silence, but it wasn't peace. It was judgment. The bedroom, once shared, now held only me and the echo of absence. I'd sit on the edge of the bed, feet on the cold floor, rubbing my knees until they warmed enough to stand. Each motion felt like a hearing. Every object in the room had become a witness. The robe she gave me hung on the hook behind the door, faded and soft from years of use. I pulled it on like armor, though it did little to protect me. I made breakfast the way I always had. 2 eggs, toast, a single piece of bacon folded in half to fit the pan just right. But I rarely finished eating. I'd find myself staring out the window, the yolks cooling on the plate. Outside, the wind moved through the maple leaves with a low rustle, like pages turning slowly in a book you weren't sure you wanted to finish. The bird bath had dried again. The hose lay curled in the grass like a sleeping snake. I'd promised her I'd keep the garden going, but I hadn't touched it in weeks. I wandered through the house each day, like a man trapped in cross-examination, each room pressing its own quiet question into my chest. Why didn't you notice? Why didn't she tell you? Why him? And above all, what will you do now? The living room felt the most accusatory. That was where David used to sit when they visited, legs crossed, arms stretched along the back of the sofa like he owned the place. I could still picture him there, laughing softly at his own stories, calling Margaret Mom with practiced ease. I thought about every time I'd poured him a drink, invited him to stay the night, trusted him with the keys to this house. With her. I sat in my recliner and stared at the empty spot where he used to sit. The cushions had long since smoothed over the shape of his body, but I could still see it. A ghost outline. A man-shaped hole filled now with betrayal. I closed my eyes and replayed every interaction. How he avoided eye contact when money was mentioned. How he always forgot to bring dessert. How he interrupted our daughter when she started to speak on anything that mattered. At the time, I'd told myself he was tired, stressed, just built that way. But now I saw the pattern. The same smooth evasions that had allowed him to slowly siphon money from the trust Margaret and I had built over a lifetime. The money we saved for their children. The money we saved for each other's peace of mind. The anger didn't come all at once. It rose slowly, like heat from a radiator. It pulsed in strange places. My hands, my temples, the back of my throat. I found myself pacing again, that old circular path from kitchen to hallway to den to dining room and back. I opened the fridge just to close it. I opened the drawer just to feel the weight of the folder again. I didn't take it out. Instead, I went into the garage and stood in the dark. The faint scent of old motor oil and dried grass lingered. My tools were still on the pegboard, labeled with masking tape and Margaret's tidy handwriting. Flathead, Phillips, spare nails, garden shears. I touched each one like it could remind me of what it meant to be firm, to be useful. In the corner, a small pile of Margaret's donations sat in a box. She had been collecting clothes and kitchen items for the church thrift store. I lifted the lid and stared down at a pair of gently used oven mitts, a teapot with a cracked handle, and a cardigan she hadn't worn in years. A note lay on top in her handwriting. For someone who needs warmth. I closed the lid and walked back inside. That night I sat in the den with a legal pad and tried to write. Not a letter, not a journal, just thoughts. But the pen barely moved. My mind circled too many things at once. David's signature, Margaret's silence, my daughter's possible complicity, and my own role in this whole unraveling. Was I a victim? A coward? Or something worse? An old man who had been too content, too tired to question what felt comfortable? I placed the pen down and stared at the wall. A small crack had formed near the molding, likely from the house settling. I hadn't noticed it before. It reminded me of Margaret's laugh lines, those small, beautiful fractures life left on her face. Except this crack wasn't beautiful. It was a split that hinted at weakness beneath the surface. The clock ticked on, but time no longer offered progress, only distance. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about legal restitution or moral clarity. It was about the quiet obligation of knowing. Once you know a thing, truly know it, you cannot unknow it. And then the question becomes, what will you do with the knowing? I made tea again. Same mug, same kettle. This time I drank it slowly, with both hands wrapped around the porcelain, as if trying to draw something out of it. In the stillness of the house, I thought about justice. Not courtroom justice, not headlines and handcuffs, but the kind that happens when truth is faced without blinking. I didn't need a jury. I didn't need a judge. I had already been handed the evidence, and now I sat inside my own verdict. The pain wasn't in the loss of money. It was in the realization that love had existed beside deception. That Margaret had lived her last years with one eye on preservation and the other on protection. She hadn't told me because she thought she was sparing me. But that act, as tender as it was, also robbed me of the chance to stand beside her in it. I could no longer ask her why, but I could answer for myself. The folder still sat in the drawer, waiting. But something in me had shifted. I no longer felt its weight as punishment. It was a responsibility, a question I had been chosen to answer, even if late. I stood, turned off the lights, and let the house settle around me. The silence no longer judged. It waited, and so did I, on the edge of something I couldn't yet name, but would no longer ignore. The courthouse smelled like old paper and disinfectant, a mixture of bureaucracy and caution, the kind of place where time thickens and everyone walks slower, either from reverence or dread. I arrived early that morning, dressed in the same charcoal gray suit I wore to Margaret's memorial. The fabric had held the shape of grief once, and now it would hold something colder: resolve. I carried the manila folder under my arm, the same one that had lived in my drawer under her stationery and the shadow of my indecision. Now it felt almost light, not because its contents had changed, but because I had. I moved through the security line, the metal detector beeping softly behind me as the guard waved me forward with a gesture more habitual than attentive. I nodded, thanked him, adjusted my glasses, and entered the long hallway that led to courtroom 6. My shoes echoed faintly on the polished tile floor, a click-click rhythm like a metronome ticking down to something final. The hallway was lined with bulletin boards pinned with notices, juror schedules, court closures, a flyer for a grief support group taped crooked in the corner. I glanced at it, but only briefly. I didn't want the word grief to follow me inside. When I entered the courtroom, the coldness struck me first. Not the air, the temperature was fine, but the arrangement of space. It was surgical, a room designed not for healing, but for cutting. The gallery benches were empty, except for a few scattered observers. A young couple in the back whispered to each other and looked at their phones. On the far side, an older woman clutched a worn handbag in her lap, like it was her last defense. Everyone had their own story, their own quiet war. We were just sharing the same stage for a day. I took a seat near the front, not on the aisle, not by the wall, right in the center, third row. I placed the folder on my knees and folded my hands over it. The wood of the bench was polished, but worn smooth by years of anxious fingers. I could feel the ghosts of other men's doubts etched into it. David entered 15 minutes later. He wore a navy blue blazer, dark slacks, no tie. His shirt was crisp, his collar open, casual but careful. His lawyer followed, a thin man with a silver tie and a briefcase that looked more expensive than my car. They didn't look at me, though I looked at them, not with hatred, with precision. I studied every twitch of David's mouth, the way his eyes moved around the room but never landed on mine. He sat at the table in front, facing the bench, but slightly turned so I could still see his profile. I recognized that profile, the same one that had appeared in my home, at my table, cutting turkey on Thanksgiving, carving ham at Christmas, smiling at my wife while she poured him coffee. Now that same face held a different tension. His hand stayed folded on the table, fingers interlaced. He didn't fidget, but his knuckles whitened. The lawyer leaned in to whisper something. David nodded once, then straightened his posture. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The clerk called the case. What followed was not dramatic. No shouting, no finger-pointing, no gasps from the gallery. It was methodical, restrained, a quiet execution of truth. Carter, representing me and Margaret's estate, stepped forward with the calm of a man who knew the weight of every word he would say. He had a legal pad, some printed statements, and the affidavit Margaret had included in the sealed envelope. He spoke clearly, without embellishment. He referenced dates, transactions, lines from the trust. He laid out the pattern of financial withdrawals, the reallocation of funds, and finally, Margaret's signed directive removing David from any legal claim. Each time Carter spoke Margaret's name, I felt it in my spine, as if she were there, just behind my shoulder, watching with folded arms, and that expression she always wore when she knew something before anyone else did. David's lawyer objected only once, something procedural, nothing that held. The judge waved it aside, like a gnat. I watched David shift slightly in his seat. He finally looked at me, briefly, and in that glance, I saw recognition, not of guilt, not of regret, but of inevitability. He knew it was over. Carter ended by presenting a copy of the amendment to the trust, signed, notarized, and witnessed. He placed it on the table with the kind of finality that doesn't need emphasis. The judge asked if there were any statements to be made. David's lawyer declined. David said nothing. Then the judge turned to me. He asked if I wanted to speak. I hadn't prepared anything. No speech, no dramatic reveal, just the steady pressure in my chest that had built over weeks. I stood. My knees cracked as I rose. I unfolded the paper Margaret had once hidden from me and held it, not to read, but to remind myself why I was here. I didn't look at the judge. I looked at David, and in that moment, I didn't see the man who had married my daughter, or the father of my grandchildren. I saw a man who had taken advantage of trust, of silence, of kindness. A man who had sat across from Margaret at our table and lied with a steady hand. I didn't speak loudly. I said only what was necessary. That Margaret had protected the family long after her death. That she had been the voice of reason, even in silence. That what had been taken could never be fully returned. But that truth, at the very least, would be recorded. The judge thanked me. I sat back down. The ruling was swift. David's claim was voided. The funds misappropriated were ordered into review. He would face a financial penalty. There would be no appeal. When it was over, the courtroom emptied quickly. People had other stories to attend to. David passed by me without a word. No apology, no acknowledgement. Just a man trying to keep the seams of his dignity from unraveling in public. His lawyer followed close behind, already speaking in low tones, likely planning their damage control. I didn't follow. I didn't stand. I sat there a while longer, listening to the quiet reassert itself in the wood-paneled walls, the empty benches, the dust floating in the high morning light. When I finally stood and left, I carried the folder under my arm again. Lighter this time. Not because the contents had changed, but because Margaret had been heard. And for the first time since her death, I felt her silence was no longer a burden I carried alone. After the courtroom, I didn't drive straight home. I wasn't ready to sit inside four walls that had once meant comfort, but now echoed with too much clarity. Instead, I turned down a familiar road, one lined with birches and dogwoods, where the air always smelled faintly of pine and old rain. The road led to the cemetery. It wasn't an impulsive decision. I'd known I would come here, even before the judgment was passed. I needed something I hadn't found in the courtroom. Not closure, not really, but witness. Someone to bear the weight of what had just occurred. Someone who mattered. The sky was overcast, but dry. The kind of gray that never promises rain, but never rules it out either. I parked beneath the maple tree that Margaret had loved in the fall, its leaves now just beginning to curl at the edges. I stepped out slowly, folder in hand, and walked the familiar path toward her headstone. The grass was damp beneath my shoes, soft and forgiving. The wind moved through the trees in long, low sighs. Around me, rows of stone markers stood like open books, each one closed on a different sentence. Her grave was where I had left it, quiet, modest, set slightly apart from the others, as if she had chosen, even in death, not to be the center of attention. Her headstone was simple, just her name, the dates, and one line beneath. She grew quiet, but never small. She had written that herself, years before we ever needed it. I'd asked her if she wanted something more poetic, more elaborate. She said no. She wanted something that sounded like her, honest, plain, defiant in its softness. I knelt beside the stone and placed the folder gently on the grass. My knees ached. The cold from the earth crept into my bones as I rested one hand on the smooth granite and let the silence settle. Not the silence of absence, but presence. The kind that fills a space rather than empties it. For a while I didn't think. I didn't plan. I didn't remember in sequence or logic. Memories just came. Stray images, scents, textures. The smell of her hands after kneading dough. The faint humming she did while folding laundry. The way she would tap the side of her teacup twice before taking a sip. Her hair always smelled like rosemary in the winter. I remembered brushing it once, early in our marriage, when she was too tired to lift her arms. She had fallen asleep in the chair with her head tilted forward, and I had sat on the carpet behind her, combing through each strand like it was something sacred. I spoke to her then, not with my voice, but in the way the body speaks when it is alone. I let my fingers press into the soil. I let my breath match the rhythm of the breeze. I let the weight of the folder beside me represent everything I couldn't articulate. I told her what happened, how David's face looked when Carter read the terms aloud, how he didn't speak, didn't argue, how the judge didn't need convincing. how the courtroom had accepted her truth like a verdict written in stone. I told her I was proud of her, that I had always been proud of her, but now even more so, that her clarity, her courage had outlived her, that her silence had spoken louder than any of our voices ever could. And then I told her I was sorry, for not seeing it, for not asking, for not standing beside her sooner. I whispered it, my forehead resting against the stone, my fingers gripping the grass like it might forgive me. There was no answer, of course, but something shifted in the air, just slightly. A softness, a loosening. I sat back and pulled the folder into my lap. I opened it one last time, not to reread, but to let the documents breathe. Pages fluttered in the wind, thin and dry, like brittle leaves about to turn. I let them sit there, touching the earth she now belonged to. There was one page Margaret had handwritten, a short letter. Not to me, not to anyone directly. Just a few lines she'd titled, "If Found After." It wasn't signed. It wasn't formal. Just thoughts. She had written about clarity, about conscience, about what it means to love a family enough to tell the truth even when no one wants to hear it. She wrote, "Sometimes love is letting go of who you want someone to be and seeing who they've chosen to become." I read that line again and again. And then I folded the letter and placed it back in the folder. I sealed it with a clip and stood. My joints protested. My breath misted faintly in the cold. I didn't take the folder with me. I placed it in the brass box we had built into the foot of the headstone, the one meant for weatherproof keepsakes. She'd once said, "If we ever write each other letters, I want them buried with me, not burned." At the time, I thought it romantic. Now I saw it was her way of archiving truth. I locked the box and brushed away a few blades of grass that had gathered along the base. I stood in the silence of the cemetery, letting the wind pass through my coat. The trees moved above me like slow applause. On the drive home, I didn't take the highway. I followed the back roads, past the places that had built our life. Her old bookstore, the park bench where we once sat and argued about whether or not to adopt a dog, the diner where she spilled coffee on our first date and laughed so hard, she nearly cried. I drove with the windows half open. The cold air kept me alert. The world outside was still the same, but I wasn't. Back at the house, I opened the door and stepped inside. It smelled faintly of cedar and dish soap. Margaret's recipe box sat on the counter where I had left it days ago. I opened it and pulled out the card for her lemon loaf, the one she baked every Sunday. I set it beside me and began gathering the ingredients, moving slowly, deliberately. And as I worked, I spoke to her again, not out loud, but with my hands, with flour, with heat, telling her I had heard her, telling her I was ready to carry what she had left, not just the truth, but the quiet courage to live with it. The morning after my visit to the cemetery, I woke before the sun. The house was still, not silent in the way it had been after Margaret died, not heavy and empty, but still in the way a field is quiet after the snow, cleansed, watchful, waiting. I made my way to the kitchen and put on the kettle. The floor creaked under my weight, the same two boards near the stove that had always complained when I stepped on them. Margaret used to joke they were her warning system, a way to know when I was sneaking a cookie after dinner. I smiled at that, the first time in a long while that the memory didn't carry a knife behind it. The air smelled faintly of citrus and something warm, probably from the lemon loaf I'd baked the night before. It hadn't turned out exactly like hers, a little dry in the middle, uneven crust, but it was close enough to feel like a ritual, like something passed down. I poured the tea into her mug, the same one I'd used all week, and carried it into the den. The light was still low, a pale blue creeping through the curtains. I didn't turn on the lamps. I let the shadows hold the room, let them stretch across the bookshelves and the armrests and the carpet. I sat in my chair, pulled the wool blanket over my legs and held the warm ceramic between my palms, like I had something to protect. The folder was gone now, buried in the brass box beneath her headstone, but its contents lived in me. The truth was part of the structure of the house now, part of the way I moved, the way I breathed. There was no dramatic shift, no thunderclap of justice, only this steadiness, this quiet. I thought about David. I'd heard from him since the ruling. I didn't expect to. There was no apology coming, no reckoning. But that was fine. I didn't need one anymore. The court had done its part, yes, but the real justice had happened in the silence, in the unveiling, in the slow, deliberate pulling back of the curtain. Margaret had done that. She had prepared it all before her death, left no loopholes, no ambiguity. She had trusted that, in time, I would know what to do, that I would act not from rage, not from humiliation, but from clarity. And I had. It hadn't been easy, it hadn't been fast, but it had been right. I rose and walked to the front window. The maple tree outside had begun to change color, early golden tips on the leaves, a signal that fall was near. Margaret had always loved this time of year. She said it was the season that told the truth. No frills, no disguises, just transition, just nature admitting that change was inevitable. The wind stirred the branches gently. A single leaf detached and spiraled downward, landing on the walkway like a signature. I turned from the window and went to the hallway closet. The old photo albums were stacked on the top shelf, behind the board games we hadn't played since our daughter left for college. I pulled them down and carried them to the dining table, where the morning light was strongest. I opened the first one. Black pages, photo corners, a faded picture of us on the porch of our first apartment. Margaret holding a potted fern and grinning at the camera like she knew everything and planned to keep it secret. I ran my hand over the plastic sleeve, then turned the page. Hours passed like that. Page after page. A life recorded in smiles, in vacations, in ordinary dinners that turned out to matter more than we realized. I wasn't searching for anything. I was just remembering, rebuilding, stitching myself back together with thread made of Saturdays and shared umbrellas and burnt pancakes. At noon, I opened the windows. The breeze carried the scent of grass and sun-warmed concrete. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a lawnmower buzzed. A dog barked, then fell quiet. Life was continuing, not loudly, but firmly. I spent the afternoon in the garden. The soil was loamy and cool, dark under the surface. I pulled weeds from the flower beds Margaret had loved, working slowly, methodically, until my knees ached and my back pulsed with effort. I found her gloves still hanging by the shed door. I put them on. They were too small, the fingers tight, but I wore them anyway. By evening, the beds were clear. I didn't plant anything. Not yet, but the space was ready, waiting. Inside, I made a simple dinner. Roasted vegetables, some bread, a little soup. I lit one candle, just one. Not for ceremony, but for company. After I ate, I returned to the den. The light had faded again. Dusk pulled its long shadows across the walls. I sat and listened to the sound of the house, its old joints, its familiar settling. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed once. 7 o'clock. I thought then about what Margaret had left me. Not money, not revenge, but a kind of instruction. A quiet blueprint. She had drawn the outline of justice in pencil and handed me the pen to finish it. And I had. Not perfectly, not without doubt, but with love. That was the victory. Not the courtroom, not the balance sheet. The victory was in the silence of that room, in the absence of shame, in the presence of memory and choice. Before bed, I wrote her a letter. I didn't say much, just that I had done what she asked, that I had heard her, finally, all the way through, that I had forgiven myself, and that I hoped she had forgiven me too. I folded the letter and tucked it into the back of her favorite book, where the pages still smelled faintly of lavender. Then I turned off the lights and let the house go still again. Not empty, just quiet and free.